Assalamu alaikum. My name is Khadija Mushtaq. I have done Masters in English Literature and Linguistics from National University of Modern Languages. I have been teaching literature and linguistics for the last 14 years now in the same university. And over here I shall be teaching you Poetry B, which involves Romantic poets and Victorian poets and the poets belonging to the modern period. We shall study how poetry has evolved over the centuries. We shall see how different poets brought in their own individual styles to poetry. We shall see how poetry has been enriched in the process. So the subject is going to be really interesting for you, and I hope that you're going to learn and benefit from the subject. In the subject that we are going to study, I'm going to focus on the three eras that I've just mentioned to you. I'm going to focus on the Romantic period, and I'm going to focus on the Victorian period, and then I shall take you to the modern period. And we shall see how poetry has developed and evolved over these periods. But I shall formally start with my analysis of the poets and their works in the next lecture. In today's lecture, in our first lecture, I should like to describe, and in fact, I'm sure you're already aware of some of the poetic techniques and the poetic devices that are part of poetry. But even then, I'd like to, use this lecture as a refresher for you. I'd like you to become familiar or to refresh your memories of some of the features that are so common to poetry, and they are so characteristic of poetry, and they distinguish poetry from prose. So we shall look at what poetry is, and we shall also look at some of the poetic devices, not all, but I would like you to study the poetic devices. I'd like you to get to know these devices, because an understanding of poetic devices and their true understanding of poetic devices will aid you and help you to a better understanding of the poem. After a brief analysis of poetry and some of the poetic devices, we shall turn our gaze towards the Romantic period. And in today's lecture, I shall discuss briefly the Romantic period and what is Romanticism, or what is this great movement that we call the Romantic movement in the English literary tradition. We shall see how it is described and what are the characteristic significant features of this movement. So today's lecture is going to benefit you in the sense that it is going to lay the foundation for all that we are to study through the course. It is going to help you with a better understanding of poetry, because I hope that after today's lecture you're going to go back to your books and you're going to find out and study about these poetic devices and some of these poetic terms, and familiarize yourselves with these, and understand how poetry is different from prose, and how it has its own character. We are all by nature, poets. Most of us are so emotional and sensitive that we like to express ourselves in some poetic forms. And when we are expressing ourselves, we, without actually realizing, we are employing some of these poetic devices. We are employing some of the techniques, but all unconsciously. And it is only when someone else has to read our work that he or she can discern the poetic devices that we may have used in the poetry that we may have composed. So the poetic devices are unconsciously used by the poet. Sometimes they're used to deceive deliberately the reader. Sometimes they're used by the poets to deliberately hide their emotions and feelings, or to confuse the reader, and sometimes they are used to make meaning more clear. Sometimes these conflicts and paradoxes, these juxtapositions, the ironies, they are there to make a certain theme, an idea, more prominent and more highlighting. So there may be various reasons for using these poetic devices or techniques, but they are used with a master stroke by the poets, and these devices, they actually lend beauty to their poems, to poetry. So it is important that you understand these devices, that you understand these terms in all forms of poetry, poetry written in all languages, not just English, though we are studying English poetry. But if you are interested in and you read other other poetry in other languages, you should be able to also enjoy that poetry because of these devices that are used in the poem by the poet. If you understand these devices yourself, you shall be able to get a better understanding of the poem that you must be reading, whether it's in Urdu or Punjabi or Pashto or Sindhi or Balochi or wherever you're from. So your understanding, your relation with a work of art, it would improve. So go for a better understanding of poetry. So just a quick and a brief recap of these poetic devices. And like I said, not all of them are we're going to look at in this lecture, because we don't have enough time to do that all. But there are so many of, they are all easily available. There are books, they're all over the net also. So you need to get hold of them and you need to study them. Now poetry, as you all know, uses forms and conventions to suggest differential interpretation to words or to evoke emotive responses. This is why, one reason why in poetry, poets use different poetic devices and techniques. These forms and conventions are used to suggest differential interpretation through words, to suggest a different interpretation, multiple interpretations to those words, or sometimes to evoke emotive responses. So these symbols, sometimes because we can relate to them, sometimes they arouse our emotions. So they give depth to the meaning and they make connection with the reader. They help make connection with the reader. But different poets in different periods have used these devices differently. When we shall come to the modern age, you shall see that they use these symbols. The poets, modern poets, use these symbols in their poems to get an emotive response, but also to confuse the reader, to allow the reader not to reach at the absolute, at the concrete. So there may be different reasons for the poets while they're employing these poetic techniques or devices. Now some devices such as assonance, alliteration, onomatopoeia and rhythm are sometimes used to achieve musical or incantatory effects. So the devices that are used to create musical effect or incantatory, repetitive, chanting effects are assonance, which is a repetition of the vowel sounds, or alliteration, which is a repetition of the first sounds of the words in the poetic line, or onomatopoeia, or which is a repetition of, not the repetition, which is a word which represents the sound, actual sound of an actual object of nature. Imitating the sounds, words imitating the sounds of an actual object. And rhythm. Rhythm is also used in the poem. The rhythm, the rise and fall in the line is used. So these are used for the musical effect. These devices enhance the lyrical, the musical quality of the poem. And the use of ambiguity, symbolism, irony and other stylistic elements of poetic diction leaves a poem open to multiple interpretations. And what makes a poem symbolic is the use of ambiguity, ambiguity. Often poets do not make clear what they are trying to say. And symbolism, symbols are used. A strange symbol for a common emotion can create confusion in the mind of a reader. We know that a red rose is a symbol of love, but if a rose is used by a poet and he's using it in a different kind of a setting, we may be confused we may find it difficult to align that symbolic value to the meaning of the poem, and that may give rise to ambiguity. So ambiguity, symbolism, and then irony, the difference in what or the gap in what is being said and what is being meant, and other stylistic elements, there are many, and of poetic diction. These are all part of poetic diction. They leave a poem open to multiple interpretations. Similarly, metaphor and simile create a resonance between otherwise disparate images, a layering of meanings forming connections previously not perceived. So in the same way, metaphors and similes, in fact, they are used to create resonance between otherwise disparate images. Meanings, the two totally opposing images may be used by the poet, but through metaphor or through the use of metaphor or simile, he can connect the two. He can show some relation between the two images. So as like we say, as white as lily, or as brave as a lion. So we are trying to connect through them two different images, two totally different images. So through these devices, as you can see, poetry is enriched, poem is enriched. So it is an important study of poetry. Now, another characteristic feature of poetry is rhyme. And the reason I'm going to take some time over the rhyme and rhythm is because they are the key features that distinguish poetry from prose. Now, rhyme, this is the one device most commonly associated with poetry by the general public. We all know that all poems have rhyme. Words that have different beginning sounds but whose endings sound alike, including the final vowel sound and everything following it, are said to rhyme. So the last words in a line, when they have the same sound, they are we say that they all rhyme. So if the last words in the first three poetic lines is time, slime, mime, so the three lines will said to be rhyming with each other. So the rhyme scheme would be A, rhyme, slime, mime, all rhyme, so A. If the fourth line, if the last word of the fourth line is stand, it is different from these three, so it will become B. So A, and then B. So this way, the rhyme in a poem is determined by the sound value of the last word in each line. The organization or rhythm. The organization of speech rhythms, by which we mean the verbal stresses. The stresses, sometimes a part of a word is stressed, is highly stressed, sometimes a part of a word is less stressed. So the organization of speech rhythms into a regular pattern of accented syllables separated by unaccented syllables is called rhythm. And rhythm helps to distinguish poetry from prose. For example, you see the smaller letter represents unaccented syllable, the less stressed syllable, and the capitalized one represents the accented syllable or the stressed syllable. So I thought I saw a pussy cat. So you see the rhythm. I say we down. I thought I saw a pussy cat. So this is how a poetic line has rhythm. Such patterns are sometimes referred to as meter, and we call this meter also. Meter is the organization of voice patterns in terms of both the arrangement of stresses and their frequency of repetition per line of verse. So meter is basically how the rhythm is arranged, how the stresses are arranged, and also what is their frequency, meaning how many times these stresses are repeated, how many times more accented syllables were repeated, how many times the less accented syllables were repeated. Poetry is organized by the division of each line into feet. Further division in a poetic line is that into feet. So feet is a metric unit where each consists of a particular arrangement of strong and weak stresses. The most common metric unit is the iambic, in which an unstressed syllable is followed by a stressed one. So meter, these are the metric units, and each one consisting of a strong and a weak stress. We describe each metric unit. Meter is a line, is the description of the rhythm of the whole line. And when you're talking about distinct metrical unit, a pattern of one unstressed and one stressed syllable, that is what we call a metric unit, and that metric unit in a line is called a feet. And the most common metric unit is iambic, which is unstressed syllable followed by the stressed one. The first one is unstressed, the next one is stressed. Like when we say the word reverse, we don't say reverse, we say reverse, reverse. So this is a feet. This is one metric unit. But when we are talking of a line, we're talking about the rhythm. We're talking about meter, the whole meter. Or compose. Compose. Come is unaccented, pose is stressed. There are 5 basic rhythms, and they are, one is iamb. If you see this, the straight line is gives you the unstressed syllable, and the slash refers to the stressed syllable. So iamb is a pattern which has unstressed first and then stressed. Trochee is stressed first, unstressed then. Anapist, 2 unstressed, 1 stressed. Dactyl, 1 stressed, 2 unstressed. Spondy is the 2 stressed ones. So these are the rhythmic patterns. And meter is measured by number of feet in a line. Line with 5 feet is called pentameter. Thus a line with 5 iambs is known as iambic pentameter. So meter, we just told you that meter is determined by the number of feet per line, and feet is a metrical, a foot is a metrical unit. And so how many metrical units are formed? So one metrical unit we have just seen is an iamb, which is a pattern of unstressed and then stressed. And the most common line lengths are, or the meter in poetry are monometer. There can be just one metric line with having one pattern, or diameter, or a line having, you know, 2 metrical units, a trimeter having 3, tetra 4, penta having 5, hexameter having 6, hepta having 7, octa having 8. Imagery, another very distinguishing feature of poetry. The use of vivid language to generate ideas or evoke mental images, not only of the visual sense but of sensation and emotion as well. While most commonly used in reference to figurative language, imagery can apply to any component of the poem that evokes sensory experience and emotional response, and also applies to the concrete things so brought to the mind. The important point here is that this use of vivid imagery, it is an important feature of poetry, and imagery is used to evoke sensory experience or and a certain emotional response. A poet uses an image so that he can introduce to us his sensory experience. When we also enact that image in our mind, through our mind eye, we can sometimes feel, sometimes see it that way also. So, or we can feel, hear, and see, and taste the same emotion. So it aims to achieve a similar emotional response for the reader. This is the purpose of imagery. So, but it is part of the figurative language in poetry. The poets carefully described impressions of sight, sound, smell, taste and touch can be transferred to the thoughtful reader through imaginative use and combinations of diction. So you see, this is what I've just explained. So these images of sight, sound, smell, taste and touch, they can all be transferred by the poet to the reader through an effective image, through effective imagery. In addition to its more tangible initial impact, effective imagery has the potential to tap the inner wisdom of the reader to arouse meditative and inspirational responses. This is the more significant quality of imagery, that they, after this tangible initial impact, that we are able to see, touch, feel the same things that the poet is seeing, feeling or touching, then it also arouses in us the meditative and inspirational responses. It touches our thought. The examples of images are like I've just explained to you: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, and then certain examples are there for you to read and to understand. Tone and mood, another very important aspect of poetry. This means by which a poet reveals his attitudes and feelings. By the tone of the poem or the mood of the poem, we mean the attitude and the feelings of the poet, and the means how he reveals those feelings and attitudes, in how he reveals them in the style of language or expression of thought. So how it is revealed. So certain tones include not only irony and satire, but maybe loving, condescending, bitter, pitying, fanciful, solemn, and a host of other emotions and attitudes. So sometimes tone and mood is determined by irony and satire. They may be the tone or maybe ironical, sometimes satirical, sometimes it may be loving, sometimes condescending, bitter, pitying, and so on and on. So, but this tone of the poem, it helps us to understand the emotion of the poet. It helps us to understand the attitude of the poem. Tone can also refer to the overall mood of the poem itself, in the sense of a pervading atmosphere intending to influence the reader's emotional response and foster expectations of the conclusion. So the tone, and so the two terms are sometimes synonymous. The tone may sometimes refer to the general mood of the poem, the atmosphere of the poem, which helps the reader form an understanding, form an emotional response to the poem, and to have expectations of a certain kind of an ending. So it is a whole atmosphere, the whole mood that is being generated by the tone of the poem. Another use of tone is in reference to pitch or to the demeanor of a speaker as interpreted through inflections of the voice. In poetry, this is conveyed through the use of connotation, diction, figures of speech, rhythm, and other elements of poetic construction. This is in reference to pitch, or how the poet is the speaker, or the speaker, how he is speaking. So tone sometimes refers to the speech of the speaker through the inflections of the voice in the character of the poem. So, and we see that the poet may sometimes use these devices like connotation, diction, figures of speech, rhythm, and other elements in order to give us a hint of the tone of the poem. So tone, we know in normal sense in conversation, refers to the pitch of the speaker. Pitch, the way I speak, the way sometimes I go high, sometimes I go low. This is what we describe as pitch. So, and my pitch describes to you my tone. So in poetry, it is actually described through connotation, through figures of speech, through the varying rhythms. Naturally, we cannot hear the characters or the speakers in the poem, but we only get to know how it is being said through the figures of speech, through the rhythms that are created, through other dictions that are used in the poem. So these were just a few poetic devices that I wanted to look at with you, because they are what define poetry. They are what poetry is. So they are characteristic of poetry. So you need to understand these terms, because this will give you a better understanding of what poetry is, and how is it that poetry can open up before you, and how is it that poetry can become simplified for you, and how is it that poetry can become accessible to you and approachable to you, and you can approach it and understand it and also enjoy it. So this should be your aim, this should be your purpose, not just to take it as a burdensome activity for your examination. Your purpose should be to understand this and get the sense of poetry, to have a feel for poetry, to have emotions for poetry, to understand truly what poetry is about. Now let us start with our actual course. The first period that we're going to start with is the Romantic period. The Romantic period is known to have started with the publication of Lyrical Ballads, which was a joint publication by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798. There are no fixed dates, there is no fixed year, but this is the date which it is most commonly associated with. I'm talking about the Romantic movement in England. Romanticism was a phenomenon all across Europe, all the European countries, and later on in America too. These new sensibilities were transferred and they shifted to, but it was a European phenomenon, not just something that was happening in England. But in England, it is known to have been initiated in 1798 with the publication of William Wordsworth's and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads, which is a collection of their poems. The poems that they published in that volume introduced a new sensibility, introduced a new poetic style, and they introduced new thoughts, new ideas. And it was a complete revolution, and it was a complete rebellion against the previous traditions. So that is why this publication, it heralds a new period, it heralds and gives birth to a new sensibility in poetry. As far as Romantic period is concerned, Rousseau plays an important role in deciding the values of this age, in fact, and also deciding the literary trends, because most of the writers were going to follow these philosophers or these thinkers. Rousseau was a Swiss philosopher, an intellectual, and his beliefs are primarily known to have called into act the French Rebellion, the French Revolution, as it is known in the English history. So a very influential philosopher in his times, a philosopher who in those times talked about liberty, who talked about liberating man from the shackles of society and from the cycle of political dominion, and wanted to liberate man from all kinds of dogmas. So he introduced a different and a rebellious thinking line in the domain of literary circles, in literary circles. So it is important that before you study Romanticism, you understand what Rousseau's beliefs actually were. The man who inspired French Revolution, the man who inspired many poets belonging to the Romantic age, the man who in that sense also inspired Romantic movement and the Romanticism of the age. So Rousseau held that society corrupts man. For him, society was corrupting. He also turned towards nature. He believed that man, when he is close to nature, is more pure. So society is corrupting while nature has a purer influence on man's sensibility. Material progress in arts and science have not been beneficial but resulted in negative traits, for example, vanity, pride, greed, etc. And he was against the materialism of the age. He was against the materialistic values and the thrust for materialistic things that was being displayed by people in that age. So he believed that all of this material progress, it resulted in negative traits in man. He believed also that sovereignty should be in the hands of the people, that people should govern societies. People should be rulers in their own rights. So he was against authority of all kind. He was against the authoritative government. He was against the autocratic rule. He was against the monarch rule. He favored what we now describe as a democratic rule, but not the kind of democracy that we now have. Rousseau might even rebel against that. So he was against any kind of authority or authoritative rule where the majority is ruled by a minority. In his own words, man is born free and everywhere he's in chains. So you see the paradox in the lines. He says man is born free, but what is happening? In the society he is in chains. Such views challenged all ideas of political domination and social injustices and heralded change. Now let's turn to the lyrical ballads and the preface to the lyrical ballads, which brought about this change, which introduced this change in poetry. With his publication to lyrical ballads, Wordsworth also wrote a preface to it, and in that preface he elaborated his poetic theory. And this is why this preface actually became a turning toward a more experimental and a more emotional lyricism, as opposed to the Augustan age poetry. So poetry became more experimental and more emotional lyricism. So we're going to study the preface to the lyrical ballads because it is a key, and it is a key to the romantic values, and it offers it offers us with a clear picture of the chief characteristics of what we today define as the Romantic movement. The first important thing that he emphasized in his preface to lyrical ballads was emphasis on natural and rustic themes in poetry. Wordsworth emphasized on natural and rustic themes in poetry. Unlike the Augustan age poets, where Pope and Swift were talking about the elite class, they were talking about the aristocratic class, and they were talking about the city life, Wordsworth wants to emphasize the natural life. He wants to emphasize the rustic themes in his poetry, and in his own words, humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because in that condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity. So he gives you reasons for his choice. He says he chooses rustic themes and natural setting and ordinary characters because he says there is more purity there. He says in that condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity and purity. And about poetry, he says poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. And then he says poetry is the outcome of a creative process. Pleasure is the state in which the poetic composition is written, and pleasure is also found in the result. So poetry for these romantics has to do with the emotions of the poet, the powerful emotions and feelings generated by the poet. But for Wordsworth specifically, it also meant the recollection of that emotion later on. About language of poetry, he says, my purpose was to imitate as far as possible, to adopt the very language of men. So the language that these poets use in their poems is also simple. It is ordinary. Especially Wordsworth, we shall see, he uses the language as he describes it himself of the ordinary. And about the role of the poet, the significance of the poet, he says, what is a poet? He is a man speaking to men, a man, it is true, endued with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature, and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. Look at the emphasis that he's placing on poet, and look at his description of poet. In fact, this is true for each of the Romantics. For them, a poet was a special being. And so he says he's a man speaking to men, his audience are men, and he has a more lively sensibility. He is unusual amongst the other men. He has more enthusiasm, he has greater knowledge of human nature, he has a more comprehensive soul. So he is a greater man than the others. And because he's a greater man, Wordsworth also suggests a new role for the poet. He says the poet's main qualifications are not in matters of craft or technique. He's a poet because his feelings allow him to enter sympathetically into the lives of others and to translate passions into words that please. And so he says a poet is not a poet because he can use techniques or crafts in the poem. So it's not just the form of the poem because of which he becomes a poet. He says he's a poet because his feelings. Because of his feelings and because of his ability to empathize with other objects, with other people, and his ability to feel like the others or to feel more for the others and to translate that passion and feeling into better words, into clearer words. And this is why, he says, is the role of the poet. The role of a poet is to enter into the lives of the others and then to translate those passions into words. So the poet actually here is the translator of the world for us. He is he's like a psychologist. He's like a prophet here. He's like a philosopher here. In fact, he's much more than them because he says that he can understand, because of his keener sensibilities, he can understand men more, and he can understand their passions, and he also has the ability to then transform that passion into words. So his job is to describe what he sees before him. Now let's come to the important factors. This was just a recap of some of the main descriptions that we get from the preface to the lyrical ballads. But these and some other characteristics completely and holistically define the Romantic movement. So we shall see those characteristic features. Some of them shall be the same that we've just looked at as were described by Wordsworth, but then Wordsworth is not the only Romantic poet. After Wordsworth we have Coleridge, then we have Shelley, we have Byron, and we have Keats too. And each of these Romantic poets had something to contribute to poetry, and that contribution has enriched a Romantic movement. So it's not just Wordsworth's contribution alone that we need to look at when we're trying to understand the Romantic movement. It is to weigh all these contributions together. So now we are going to take all of these bits of contributions, and we are going to take a look at them all quickly and hope that we will have a better understanding of the Romantic movement. So first of all, as a reaction, Romantic movement was a reaction. It was a reaction, number one, to the changes in society. And what were those changes in the society? In the 19th century, the early part of middle and the later part of the 18th century, and then going on into the 19th century, many changes were occurring in the society. The first one was industrialization. This industrial revolution had changed the cities and the city life in most of the major cities in England. So as a result of industrialization, There was destruction of natural beauty and peace. It caused an uncontrolled growth of the city. Small towns called mushroom towns were constructed for the workers. All cottage industry was destroyed, and movement of people, because of the movement of people to cities. So these factors, these were the results of industrialization, and this was how industrialization brought ugliness to the cities. It destroyed natural peace. It destroyed the natural beauty, and it resulted in overcrowded cities. It resulted in dirty cities. It resulted in diseases in the cities. It resulted also in begging in the cities. So the life in the cities changed considerably due to industrialization. And then another factor was urbanization, which is linked to industrialization, and which I have partly discussed with you right now. But urbanization refers to how the cities were, city life changed, or how the cities were changing. In the city, what happened as a result of industrialization? Poor living conditions in cities for workers. Living in the city meant long working hours and appalling living conditions. Industrial cities lacked elementary public services like water supply, sanitation, street cleaning, and open spaces. So urbanization was another result of industrialization, and that was also a disturbing factor. Then materialism. So Romantic movement was a reaction against materialism also. This increase in greed and vanity, and and the rise of the middle class and their greed and vanity, all of that increasing in the lives of people living in the city. Wordsworth and the other Romantic poets rebelled against these. So Romantic movement was basically initiated, and it is known to have been a reaction against these, against industrialization, against urbanization, and against the materialism. Then, secondly, it is also a reaction against the rigid social structures in the society. The French Revolution, firstly, which took place in 1789, overthrow of monarchy and establishment of republic form of government. So, this was the result of French Revolution. A republican form of government was established. But French Revolution was disappointing. It brought disillusionment also to most of the Romantic poets, who were ardent, fervent supporters of French Revolution, of this movement of common people. In France, common people had rebelled against the monarchy and against the autocratic rule. So people came out of their homes, they thronged the cities, and they overthrew their own monarchy, and they took reins of the government. But then the history repeated itself. Nothing changed. The leader, Napoleon, who imposed himself as the head of the Republican government, he became a similar autocratic ruler, a similar imposer as the previous monarchy rule was. So most of the Romantics were disillusioned and disturbed, greatly disturbed by the events of the French Revolution. Then there was the American War of Independence going on in the American colonies, which was also a freedom struggle. So the Romantics took notice of everything that was happening around the world and had to do with the freedom struggle. They were inspired by French Revolution. They were inspired by the War of Independence going on in the American colonies in America. And although they were disillusioned later on with the results of the French Revolution, but it was this inspiration to the rebellious movements across the world, and the inspiration to the freedom struggles across the world, that is the cherished part of the Romantic poets. And They emphasize emphasis on natural rights and freedom of individual. Now, Romantic movement emphasized natural rights and freedom of individual, and this was in line with Rousseau's ideas and philosophy. The whole idea of nationalism changed, and so did the Romantic view. It consisted then in self-determination and a pride in the national origins. Nationalism became an important attribute of the Romantic poets. So it was to determine their own position in society, in the world, and they took pride in their national origins. The Romantic movement was also a reaction to Enlightenment. It was a revolt against the literary and artistic traditions of the 18th century. It was a reaction to classicism, as we could describe it in English literature history. There are some differences that I have listed here for you. Like in the classicism, society was believed to be good, and it was believed to curb violent tempers. But in Romantic age, it becomes evil and corrupt. The characters in the works, they were ideal and eternal in classical period, but in the Romantic period, nature becomes a character. And in the classical period, the world is seen as ideal, static, and objective. But in the Romantic period, it becomes fantastical. It is subjective, viewed from the perspective of the poet, and it is dynamic. Then in the classical period, the artist is just an observer, an imitator. Art was an imitation, but an artist was an observer of nature. But in Romantic period, the artist is the interpreter of nature. He translates what he sees into his poetry. So he's an interpreter, he's a supreme being, he's a knowledgeable being. There is emphasis on rationality and logic in classical period. In the Romantic period, the emphasis is on sentiments and passion. And in the classical period, the hero actually is dominated by the moral character. So morality is important. But in the Romantic period, this sentimental hero is constantly in touch of absolute. He's lost, he's a rebel, and he's trying to find some sustenance, some support. In classical period, the artistic language and style were emphasized, but in the Romantic period, as we've discussed, simple diction is used. So we've seen how Romantic movement was a reaction. It was a reaction to the classicism. It was a reaction to the rigid social structures, like the monarchy in France, like the colonial rule in America, and like we see here also when Shelley is going to rebel against the social structures in English society. And we saw how it was a reaction to industrialization, to urbanization, and to the materialism of the age also. Now let's look at some other characteristic features of the Romantic movement. Romantic movement basically relies heavily on imagination. Imagination is a key feature of all Romantic poets, and imagination is a faculty to which each Romantic poet is heavily indebted to. It is a faculty which is like a goddess for each Romantic poet. So it is like a goddess from which they seek inspiration. So imagination was elevated to a position of the supreme faculty of the mind. It was the supreme faculty of the mind. The Romantics tended to define and to present the imagination as our ultimate shaping or creative power. So imagination shaped the ideas of the poet. Imagination was the only creative power. It created ideas in the mind of the poet. It was the approximate human equivalent of the creative powers of nature or even deity. So it was imagination which made the poet at par, which brought him at par with the deity or with nature, with God or with nature. So imagination, because of this quality, the poet became an equal to God or even to nature, because through that imagination he could look into the true nature of things. The imagination for these Romantics was dynamic and active. rather than a passive power with many functions. Imagination is a primary faculty for creating all art. Poet's capacity of imagination differentiated him from the ordinary. So it was a distinguishing faculty of a poet. It was a distinguishing faculty which distinguished the poet from the ordinary. Imagination is extolled as the ultimate synthesizing faculty, enabling humans to reconcile differences and opposites in the world of appearance. The reconciliation of opposites is a central ideal for the Romantics. When we study the poetry, you will understand this concept better, but it is a synthesizing faculty. It resolves and it reconciles difference and contradictions in the poetry. It is through imagination that the poet, the ambivalences, the different attitudes of the poets, the different feelings of the poet, they are all resolved, they are all reconciled in the end. The poet describes one thing, but he's feeling totally different. These contradictions, paradoxes continue throughout the poem. But then, through this ability or synthesizing faculty of imagination, the poet is able to resolve these opposites. Like Blake said, one power alone makes a poet, imagination, the divine vision. And Coleridge said, it is a supreme poetic faculty. So see, poets have paid tribute to this faculty. Another important characteristic of the Romantic poets is their love for nature. Romantics emphasize the importance of nature and the primal feelings of awe, apprehension, and horror felt by man on approaching nature. So when they were near nature, sometimes they felt awe, sometimes they felt apprehension, fear, sometimes they felt horror. So nature inspired fear and horror and awe in the poets. Nature was not only appreciated for its visual beauty, but also revered for its ability to help the urban man find his true identity. And nature was after it inspired awe, sometimes it inspired awe in man because of its greatness, and then sometimes it inspired man because of its beauty. And it was also revered. Look at the word revered. It is the word revered we use for someone, for some great adoration. So he says nature was almost revered by these poets because it enabled man and helped him in his search for who he really is and for his true identity. Importance was given to the accurate observation and description of the wild nature, which serves as a stimulus to thinking and to the resolution of personal problems and crises. So there is a step by step, there is a journey which these Romantic poets take in their relationship with nature. First they observe the nature, there is an accurate observation of nature involved, then they describe the nature, the description of nature, and this observation and this description, this is stimulus to thinking. They are made to think while they are describing nature. They are made to think, and then thinking leads to the resolution of the problems. So nature at the end basically helps man resolve his problems and crises. Closeness to nature was seen as bringing out humanity's innate goodness. This was why the ordinary people are hailed by Wordsworth, because he says that they are purer and they are truer people. Nature meant many things to the Romantics. Nature as a healing power, nature as a source of subject, an image, nature as a refuge from the artificial constructs of civilization, including artificial language, as a spirit, etc. Romantics gave greater attention both to describing natural phenomena accurately and to capturing sensual nuances. Now, when they were talking about nature, this is also important. Romantics did not only describe the beauty of the natural nature, they also captured the sensual nuance. They also captured the sensual feelings. It was a description of sight, sound, of hearing, of touch, of taste. All of those were brought into their descriptions. Romantic nature poetry is essentially a poetry of meditation. And this is another significant thing. The nature poetry is not just a description of the outward beauty of nature, but it is that it enables the closeness to nature, enables the poet, enables man to meditate, to think upon his condition, to think about his relation to society, about his relation to man, relation to universe. Romantic poets take inspiration from natural world and they rejoice in its beauty. This is also another aspect. They take inspiration from it, but they also rejoice in its natural beauty. Another important characteristic is the emphasis on symbolism and myth. Symbols were valued because they could simultaneously suggest many things. So they will use them. Sometimes the west wind is a symbol, sometimes the skylark is a symbol, sometimes a nightingale, sometimes a Grecian urn, sometimes the ghost ship, sometimes a journey, sometimes a solitary reaper. So symbols are used because they could suggest many things. It may also have been the desire to express the inexpressible, the infinite, through the available resources of language that led to a symbol at one level and myth at another. So as he said, the argument is that maybe the symbols were used so that the poets could express what they could not express easily otherwise through words. Sometimes when our feelings are too powerful, overpowering to be expressed, we use or take help of symbols. So he says that must be made the purpose or the reason behind the Romantics' use of symbols. So that at one level those words are symbols, at symbolic level they are symbolic, but at the other level they become a myth. The myth is a description of a symbolic narrative. So when they are read at a greater level, they become a myth. And most often the intense feelings were described using symbols. Another characteristic, individualism. I've told this to you, the Romantics asserted the importance of the individual, the unique, even the eccentric. So the individual was unique. An individual poet was important. They preferred the outclass and the rebel. Themes of exile was common. So they preferred the outclass, the rebel. Like Shelley was a rebellion. Like Wordsworth and Coleridge rebelled against the Augustan tradition. Like Byron rebelled against the social and norms of his world. So we see, because they were rebels, exile was common. Most of them take refuge somewhere. Some turn to nature, some go elsewhere. So exile was a common theme. In fact, in Shelley's opinion, Satan, in his noble defiance, was the real hero of Milton's Paradise Lost. So all rebels, all rebels, they become heroes for these Romantics. Even the Satan, the hero of Milton's Paradise Lost, Shelley describes him as the hero of Paradise Lost because they valued rebelliousness so highly. There was a great belief in democratic ideals, concern for human liberty and outcry against different forms of tyranny. So individual beauty, liberty, individual freedom, individual rights, they were important for Romantics. Human was seen as creating the world and having access to the infinite via the faculty of imagination. So an individual was important because he gave an important contribution, he made an important contribution to the world. This refusal to accept limitation found expression in bold poetic experimentation. And it was this inhibition, this refusal to accept this inhibition that was imposed on them by the Augustan age thinkers and writers that resulted in this experimentation, this Romantic movement that we have it now. So it was this rebelliousness, this spark of energy of these Romantic poets that initiated this wonderful movement in the English history. Then their emphasis on the everyday and the exotic. I put the two together. The Romantics turned to the contemporary country, such as folk legends and older unsophisticated art forms, such as the ballad, and to contemporary court country folk who used the language of common men. So they turned to both. They turn to the contemporary country, the present-day country, like Wordsworth, describing the natural present-day country. Shelley also, we have Keats also, we have Coleridge also. So they use folk legends, some of the folk legends in their poetry also to describe the present events, but they use older, unsophisticated art forms like the ballad also. They also experiment with ballad. So they like to use the everyday and also the exotic. The Romantics were also fascinated with the exotic. Often both the everyday and the exotic appeared together in paradoxical combinations. In the lyrical ballads, for example, Wordsworth and Coleridge agreed to divide their labors according to two subject areas, the natural and the supernatural. So you see, the fascination with both the everyday, the natural, and the exotic, the supernatural, is found with the Romantics. There was renewed interest in the Middle Ages also, especially the ballad form as a beautiful, exotic, mysterious, bygone period. Another characteristic is the romantic artist in the role of the romantic artist in the society. We've discussed an individual, the freedom of the individual, how it was important for them, but the Romantics were ambivalent towards the real social world around them. Now what do these feel? What do this romantic artist feel? He was not happy with the real world around him. They were often politically and socially involved, but at the same time they began to distance themselves from the public. This happened with most of them. Wordsworth and Coleridge personally took part in French Revolution, but after the results they distanced themselves from the revolution. Shelley was also inspired by it, but he too distanced himself from it, although he remained an idealist and he still believed and hoped in revolutions. And Byron, Shelley and Byron were actually also politically involved in some of the freedom struggles around in some other places. So they were part, sometimes physically, sometimes morally, part of these freedom struggles, movements in different parts of the world. But at the same time, they distanced themselves from society because they felt that the society had nothing to offer to them and that society was suffocating. The romantic artists interpreted things through their own emotions, and these emotions included social and political consciousness, as one would expect in a period of revolution, one that reacted so strongly to the oppression and injustice in the world. So they wanted to interpret things in their own way. They wanted to define the world around them in their own manner. And this was why they emphasized so much on the freedom of man and the freedom of the individual. So society was no place for these romantic artists. They withdrew more and more from what they saw as the confining boundaries of bourgeois life, this middle-class life. Yet a significant romantic theme became the contrast between the artist and middle class, or Philistine, the term which is used by Matthew Arnold to refer to the middle class. So we shall see that as the artist distances himself from the society, he also distances himself from this rising materialistic middle class, and he moves out of the society. He lives on the fringes of the society, and he fails to play an active part or active role in society. Another feature is lyric poetry and the self. And we know from Wordsworth's definition of poetry that poetry is an expression of emotions and feelings. And by locating this ultimate source of poetry in the emotions of the artist, basically, Wordsworth has given a very different status to poetry. So as in the second paragraph here, it says, this led to a prominence for first-person lyric poetry never accorded in any previous period. So the style of poetry changed because the emphasis was now on the personal and the subjective form of poetry. So the first person lyric poetry was created, never recorded in any previous poetry. The poetic speaker became less a persona and more a direct person of the poet. So the persona or the speaker or the voice in the poem was not a persona. It was not someone speaking on behalf of someone, but it was a direct actual voice of the poet. So this is an important feature of Romanticism. Then emotions versus rationality. We know that Romantics, they emphasize emotions over rationality. So Romanticism placed human emotions, feelings, instinct and intuition above everything else. While the poets in the era of rationality adhered to the prevalent rules and regulations while selecting a subject and writing about it, the Romantic writers trusted their emotions and feelings to create poetry. So emotions were valued by the Romantic poets, while rationality was valued by the poets of the Augustan age. And this is why we see all poets writing from their emotions, from their feelings, and describing their emotions and describing their feelings as best as they can in their poems. Nationalism is another characteristic, and this shows through their interest in developing the folklore, the culture, the language, the customs, the traditions of their own country. So they developed a sense of nationalism, which is reflected in their work, of unity in the country. So they talked about their country, they talked about the culture of the country. So in that way they increased the nationalism. So also the language which is used by the Romantic poem is simple and it is easy to understand by the masses. That's also another part of the nationalism. Another key feature of the Romantic poetry is supernaturalism. The Romantics, although were more inspired by nature, but supernaturalism or the supernatural forms are also part of their poetry. The Romantics were interested in supernatural and included it in their works. Gothic fiction emerged as a branch of Romanticism after Horace Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto. This fascination for the mysterious and the unreal also led to the development of Gothic romance, which became popular during this period. Supernatural elements can also be seen in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, The Rime of Ancient Mariner, and Keats' La Belle dans sa Mercé. So supernaturalism, whose history I've just given you, it was also an important development of the Romantic poetry of these poets. In the course, we're going to study 3 Romantic poets. In fact, we're going to study 4 Romantic poets. And they include the first generation Romantic poets who are William Wordsworth, Coleridge, and from amongst the second generation Romantic poets, we shall study Shelley and Keats. But here is a whole list for you of the poets who belong to the first generation and the second generation. The first generation Romantic poets include William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The second generation Romantic poets include Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. We are not going to do all of them. I have chosen for you William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge from the first generation, and I've selected Shelley and Keats from the second generation. So these 4 Romantic poets we are going to evaluate in this course. Now just a brief description of these poets. We will have a detailed discussion when we are discussing their poetry, but since this is the introductory lecture, I would like to leave you with some association or familiarity with these poets. Now, William Blake's life was spent in rebellion against restrictive influences of institutions such as government and the church. And he was aware of the negative effects of rapidly developing industrial and commercial society. Now, from this description, you can see that he was a rebel himself. And he also rebelled against institutions, against restrictions, against industrialization, against commercialization. So an artist turning away from society, from the corruption of society, and facing nature. Examples from his works are listed below. You can take a look at them. And this gives you briefly the life, gives you a brief description of the life of William Blake, when he was born and when he died. This should offer you, just a brief, it should improve your knowledge about the poet. So I thought it would be interesting for you, and it would help you to understand the poet better later on when you're assessing their works. William Wordsworth next. The next poet, William Wordsworth, we shall be studying in this course also. His poetry emphasizes the value of childhood experience and the celebration of nature. These are the two main themes. He glorifies the spirit of man living in harmony with his natural environment, far from the spiritual bankruptcy of city life. Pantheistic identified nature with God. He was pantheistic. He identified nature with God. Wordsworth is best known as a nature poet who found beauty, comfort, and moral strength in the natural world. For him, the world of nature is free from corruption and stress and offers man a means of escape from industrialized society. So, emphasizing nature, emphasizing the childhood experiences, emphasizing closeness to nature, this is William Wordsworth, and as we shall study his work, you shall understand his relationship with nature better. This is just a brief description of the life of William Wordsworth. You can read it, and again you shall benefit from it. Then we have Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now Coleridge's poetry deals with the mysterious, the supernatural, and the extraordinary. His poetry is significant because it deals with mysterious, supernatural, and the extraordinary, things that we are not aware of, things that are not part of our lives. While Wordsworth looked for the spiritual in everyday subjects, Coleridge wanted to give the supernatural coloring of everyday reality. So this was a difference in the approaches of the two poets. Wordsworth wanted to see in all objects of nature a spiritual presence, and for Coleridge everyday reality and our everyday scene became supernatural. In the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge describes a natural and supernatural events. He describes natural and supernatural events that occur during the adventurous voyage. The events of the poem take place in an eerie, ghostly atmosphere, and the reader often feels he's moving from the real to an unreal world and then back again. So these shifts give the beauty to this poem. The shift from natural to supernatural, then from back to natural, then back again to supernatural. This moving in and out from natural to supernatural lends beauty to this poem. Then you have a brief description of the life of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You can read it and assess how he spent his life for yourself. Then we have Byron. And Byron now was a prototype of the Romantic poet. He was heavily involved in contemporary social and the political issues of his times. And like his heroes, like the heroes in his long narrative poems, he's also a melancholic and a solitary figure. And he's often described as a Byronic hero because of these associations and the themes and the characteristics that he associates with his main character in his poems. Then Shelley we have, and Shelley we shall see as a more revolutionary poet. We shall see him as a nonconformist, and we shall find in him a soul striving to bring about change or reform in the society. He was an individualist and an idealist who rejected the institutions of family, church, marriage, and the Christian faith, and rebelled against all forms of tyranny. So he shall come out as a reformer to us. Then we have John Keats. John Keats's life makes his literary achievements even more astonishing. The main themes of his poetry are the conflict between the real world of suffering, death and decay, and the ideal world of beauty, imagination, eternal youth. Now this first sentence, that John Keats's life makes his literary achievements even more astonishing, it suggests a sad fact. He lived for a very short while. He died in 3 to 4 years in which he composed these remarkable poems. So he was the youngest of the Romantics to embrace death. That is why his literary achievements are more astonishing, and that is why his main themes are also sad, and are also sometimes have a hint of pessimism. He displays a conflict between the real world of suffering and death and decay, and contrasts this with the ideal world of beauty and imagination and eternal youth. With this, we come to an end to our introductory lecture. In this lecture, I have reviewed with you this Romantic movement, and we have seen in detail some of the characteristic features of Romanticism. I have put them in a certain way for you, but there are different ways to describe them. I leave it to you to improve your reading and to make it more enriched. So bring your own knowledge also to the substance that I have contributed to you. Now in the next lecture we shall start with the first Romantic poet that we shall do in this course, and that is William Wordsworth. We shall start with an introduction to William Wordsworth, and then we shall do the first poem, that is The Solitary Reaper by William Wordsworth. I shall leave you now at the end of this first lecture today, and meet you again in the next lecture with an analysis of Wordsworth's poem. So till then, good day and thank you.